Good morning. We are so delighted that you can be with us today. I invite you to sit back and relax, get your cup of coffee if you haven't already, enjoy your cup of tea. We're going to have a terrific day together. My name is John Terrell, and I'm a member of the Awaken Dane leadership team, and I also serve as the executive director of Upper House and the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation. We had hoped to welcome you in person this morning. About now, I would be acclimating you to the Upper House space, but I'm actually not at Upper House, and we have a very small team at Upper House today. So there's no need to acclimate you. We just felt it would be best to move to a digital format given all of the COVID concerns. So thank you for being flexible with us. Now, we're going to be challenged a bit with connection in this digital format, but we do believe we have a really special morning planned that will strengthen your vision, our collective vision, and also our relationships. The purpose of our plenary gatherings is to bring together the full cohort, the full cluster of Awaken Dane participants to engage in shared learning on important topics and issues that are salient to our community. Awaken Dane participants, you, will experience 4 plenary sessions over the next 13 months or so. Today, we're exploring the theme of belonging. On June 11th, we'll tackle the issue of race. In September, we'll talk about the built environment. And then in February, education with a focus on primary and secondary education. And then in the next cohort, we will tackle city movements, politics, higher education in the university, and then finally the workplace. Now, much of what happens through Awaken Dane is centered on discerning God's work within your particular zip code, or you might even think about the zip code plus the 4 digits, the +4 codes that really get to a particular route, or I think a 4-block area within most cities and regions. In the plenary sessions, we're actually going to zoom out. We're going to spend time exploring the issues that are most important to our county and our city. Chris, tell us a little bit more about today's theme.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm really excited about our theme this morning, which, as you mentioned, is belonging. And as the planning team was getting together, putting together these plenaries, thinking about our particular cultural moment and context, we very quickly identified a number of interrelated challenges that today we're engaging as our crisis of belonging. And I want to frame it up for us just a little bit before we hand it over. At one level, this crisis is a basic feature of the human situation. You know, in the opening pages of the Bible, we read it's not good for Ha Adam, the earthling, to be alone. We're made for relationship, we're made for belonging. And as the Genesis narrative goes, these relationships and this belonging has been fractured by sin. And the fall itself creates this crisis of belonging and estrangement and alienation from one another and from God and from the rest of creation. So, in the one way, our crisis of belonging is a permanent crisis. It's on this side of the new heaven and the new earth. It's sort of what it's like to be human. But this permanent crisis of belonging takes shape in particular and peculiar ways in each time and place. And in our time and place here in the U.S. in the second decade of the 21st century, the crisis of belonging, or at least our experience of it, has gone from sort of this slow simmer in the background to a rolling boil that's splattering and spilling all over the place and causing all kinds of trouble for society and real challenges for the church. On the one hand, this crisis of belonging looks like an epidemic of loneliness. Barna, I saw, put out some research last month showing that 3 in 10 US adults reported feeling lonely every day of the last week. 3 in 10 felt lonely every day. And for the adults who said that they were lonely maybe just once or more during the week, that ranged for 2 out of those out of 5 of those from feelings of loneliness that were somewhere between intense and unbearable. So loneliness really is a challenge, and of course the pandemic is a factor exacerbating this. But widespread loneliness has been a troubling trend in the West for really a long time, coming along often with depression and suicide. And so we've got, on the one hand, this loneliness epidemic reflecting a lack of belonging. But on the other hand, we have virulent partisanship and ideological polarization, which we might see as a form of toxic belonging, a belonging that's increasingly characterized by demonizing the other. Um, of course, there's other kinds of toxic belonging besides sort of strictly partisan belonging. White nationalism comes to mind. So we've got at the same time this absence of belonging and also this presence of toxic forms of belonging. And for the church, these sort of double-headed crisis isn't just out there. Sadly, it's descriptive of us and our churches as well. So while we hear Christ's call to be a city on a hill that models for the world a more excellent way, the reality is that many of us and many of the folks in our churches are also lonely and not experiencing the joy and fulfillment of Christian community. And at the same time, our churches are sometimes rent by these polarizing pressures, or they've already sort of squarely located themselves on one side or the other of this polarized map in which we live. So we've got churches for progressives and churches for conservatives, churches for activists, churches for theological purists, and on and on. And it seems that political and ideological belonging are really primary for many of the folks in our churches, and maybe even for us, that our churches are chosen based on these political tribes. And this creates a real crisis for this question of what it means to belong. What is Christian belonging? I'm confident this morning that we're going to begin to sort of unravel what's at stake and perhaps to chart out some way markers for the path ahead, how we faithfully be God's people and bear witness to the gospel in in the midst of such a crisis of belonging. Some of the questions on my mind as we're heading into this is, what does it mean to have belonging for folks whom God has made a people through Christ, who claim that Jesus is Lord, who by the power of the Spirit have been knit into one body? How are we in our local churches supposed to address the epidemic of loneliness, the spiritual and psychological pain of not experiencing belonging? At the heart of our Christian teaching and practice is the conviction that we, collectively, are united in baptism and by our participation in the body of Christ through his life, death, and resurrection. And in fact, this baptismal belonging to God and to one another is supposed to be an anchor for our personal and group identity and belonging. So how might we more fully grasp and embody this truth in our church contexts and in our county? How do we take steps towards embodying the truth that as Christians in Dane County, even as we all belong to God, we also belong to one another, and in some way then belong together? What is our call as God's people to address the wider crisis of belonging that's in our society? And how do we partner with God in bringing people into community, into relationship, and into solidarity? Well, these are some of the kinds of questions that we're going to be exploring this morning. And as the team put this together, there was no one that we wanted more to help us think about these really important dynamics than Parker Palmer. So I know we're in for a treat. I'm going to hand it back over to John to introduce our moderators. John?
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Chris. It's a delight to be able to introduce our two moderators to you. Phil Hasslinger spent 34 years as a journalist at the Capital Times, and last year was inducted into the Wisconsin Newspaper Hall of Fame. He spent 10 years as the pastor at Memorial United Church of Christ in Fitchburg. In his alleged retirement, and that's in quotes because he really hasn't retired, he's been redeployed in so many ways. He's serving on the boards of Just Dane and the Center for Journalism Ethics. He's leading clergy support groups and delighting in being a husband, a father, and a grandfather. Rebecca Cooks is a UW-Madison alumna and Chancellor Scholar. She has spent the last 5 years working in vocational ministry in Madison, first at High Point Church and currently here at Upper House. At Upper House, Becca manages programming hospitality, directs the internship program, and teaches in the Fellows program. She's an invaluable member of our team and does a wonderful job and has a wonderful way of befriending and mentoring students. Welcome, Phil and Becca.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it, John.
Becca, it's great to be here with you this morning. It's been fun working on this together.
Thank you.
I think many of you are probably already familiar with Parker Palmer, so I won't do a long introduction of him, but let me just say a few things. Parker is a writer, a podcaster, a mentor to many, a lover of poetry, and his love of poetry is often reflected in his posts on Facebook, where he highlights poems and says a few words about them. And one of his latest passions is the game Wordle, which some of you may be familiar with, where you try and figure out a word on a bunch of boxes. He says, besides being a glorious waste of time, it has one big socially redeeming feature. The daily puzzle can be solved only by actual facts. Imagine that. He is the founder of the Center for Courage and Renewal. He's written 10 books, guides to people discerning what to do and who to be, guides to teachers, a guide to democracy and community, and a guide to always be, whatever our age, as his most recent book says, on the brink of everything. We're lucky to have Parker be a resident of Madison. He lives here with his wife, Sharon, and we are so grateful that he can be with us today. I'd like to sort of frame up, picking up on what Chris was saying. Many of you may be familiar with Rachel Held Evans, a phenomenal author, Christian voice who died way too young a couple of years ago. Her friend Jeff Chu helped finish her last book, which just came out. It's called Wholehearted Faith. And in that, Rachel writes, wholeheartedness is about seeing and comprehending my place in a bigger family of faith, just as parenthood has transformed my understanding of my role in a biological and social unit. It's about risking hurt and confusion for the sake of the thing that so many of us seek, belonging. And Jeff Chu added in a conversation with Krista Tippett, I want to belong. Isn't that one of the greatest desires of every human? I don't know that we can remain tender-hearted alone. I don't know that we can survive alone. We weren't built for that. We need community. We need love. We need to belong. So Parker, welcome. I'd like to maybe start out.
So good to be with you guys. Thank
Great.
you.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe start out just talking a little bit about in your own life, places where you have found belonging, maybe starting out, in the years when you were young, you were part of a mainstream congregation. Were there places there where you found a sense of belonging?
Yeah, back when woolly mammoths roamed the earth, that kind of thing. Yeah, take a little trip. Absolutely. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago. My parents were much involved in a Methodist church in Wilmette, Illinois, and so I was involved with that too, as were my two sisters. And I learned some very, very important lessons at Wilmette Methodist Church, as it was then called. I have to say that the adult services didn't speak that profoundly to me, but the church was blessed with a really engaging youth minister who never wanted anything more than to be the best youth minister possible. And the youth group that gathered there, the high school group, especially in my memory, drew on kids from New Trier High School, which is a very competitive high school with a lot of social stratification, the way it goes on in high school. There were the popular kids and the geeky kids and the athletic kids and the party kids and the kids who were in the auto shop. But what was beautiful about the Methodist Youth Fellowship at the Wilmette Methodist Church was that all of those class distinctions disappeared. This particular youth minister, a man by the name of Bert Randall, knew how to draw everyone in who was willing to at least take a step in this direction, and knew how to create an environment where everybody felt they belonged. And I think, Phil, that was really my first taste of what the beloved community might look like. And without wanting to make too big of a deal of it, when I got to Union Seminary years later and learned that an ancient church historian named Tertullian had said of the early church that their secret was outsiders looking in and and being able to say, see how they love one another, even though who was inside the church were strangers, as it were. And in those days, being a stranger was dangerous. But the proclamation of the church was through the lived life within the church, according to Tertullian. See how they love one another. And that's what I saw in this youth group growing up.
That's a wonderful place to begin a story of belonging. I'm thinking then, jumping forward a few years, you had done academic work, you'd been a community organizer, and then you went to Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker community in Pennsylvania, and I think you had a different dimension to feeling the sense of belonging there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, very much. I think it is important to note that after I finished my academic work, I went in 1969 to Washington, D.C. to become a community organizer around issues of racial justice. And after 5 years of that work, I kind of got a clue that I had never really lived intentionally and intensely and deeply in quote community. And so with my family, I went to this Quaker place called Pendle Hill near Philadelphia for what I thought was going to be a 1-year sabbatical. Turned out to be 11 years of life in this intentional Quaker community, where about 80 people had a daily round of life together, eating meals together, worshiping together, Quaker style, engaging in study together, engaging in social outreach. The curriculum, the study program, which was offered as, in a way, as our cash crop to both resident students, adult students, and students at large, was all about spirituality and social change. It joined the inner and the outer life in nonviolent social change, which of course proceeds from within. So there's a lot to talk about, which we don't have time for today, about what I learned by living that intensely and intentionally with 80 people for 11 years. But the one piece I want to lift up is that Pendle Hill practiced absolute economic equality. Merton once said, the monastery is the only place where communism has ever really been tried. And Pendle Hill was similar, I think. Everybody who worked there, I was Dean of Studies with a PhD from Berkeley. Another person would be an 18-year-old who came in after high school not knowing what else to do, to work in the kitchen or the garden or the shop. Everybody who worked there got the same base salary. The only increments to that were if you had kids. And the salaries were very modest and the increments more modest still. But I can't say enough about what 11 years of living in radical economic equality did for me, to grind down some of the sense of entitlement that comes with being a person like me, and to help me understand that people are to be valued not by the power they have, not by the wealth they have, not by the money they make, not by the status of their position, but by who they are, what they do, what they say, and really fundamentally whether they are good neighbors. It sounds simple, and it is, and yet in our kind of society, I count it a breakthrough to really grok that, see it, understand it, feel it in its deepest form.
Yeah, and those are two wonderful examples of that sense of seeing each other as community, not seeing each other on a hierarchy. Let's jump up to the current day. Where do you find your sense of belonging now in this era of COVID? In a city, you're not part of an egalitarian community at this point. So where do you find belonging, and how do you nurture that sense of belonging?
Well, like all of us, right at this very moment, and for the last couple of years, my opportunity to be face to face with people has been cut very, very short. For 50 years, I've traveled the country doing talks, lectures, workshops, retreats, as you said, founded an organization, the Center for Courage and Renewal, that spreads work like that throughout the world through 300 facilitators. And I miss all of that very much, but it's just important to keep living and to keep living out our fundamental values, one of which, as Chris so eloquently named it, is this need to be with each other, to be in community as the communal creatures we are. And so the best that a lot of us are able to do right now is to be together like this online. So I'm blessed to have done a work for 50 years that has had me, writing messages, stuffing them into bottles and tossing them in the ocean. They're called books, and a certain community builds up that way. I'm also blessed to have had long experience teaching, speaking, being interviewed, interviewing, and so forth. And so the community, I find, that really is in so many ways wonderfully sustaining for me. It ain't the old community, it's the new community, and I'm very glad for it. And of course, with the rest of us, I look forward to the day when more face-to-face is possible. I do miss it, but I don't spend a lot of time grieving its loss. I try to make the best use out of this medium that I possibly can.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, Becca, can you take us from an individual story to like church? Take us to church, Becca.
Take us to church. I'll take you to church. Yeah. Yes. So Phil and I both have had experience working in churches, and so I think I want to redirect the questions to thinking about what our expectations of belonging ought to be, particularly in the church, and then maybe we can broaden to look outside of the church. So when I started working at a church in Madison, I started paying more attention to how the early church was started and just how it functioned. And it was very clear that it was not a group of people that naturally felt like they belonged together. Belonging did not readily come to them. They had different backgrounds, ethnically, socioeconomically, take your pick, different values, different ideas on how worship should be carried out, the whole shebang. And yet they were still named one body. They were named that they belonged to each other, but it was something that they needed to be called to, something that they needed to strive for. And so I found that interesting, to say the least, that it didn't come naturally and that it wasn't just based on agreement. So then that brings me to my speculation or my question, which is, does belonging mean more than agreement or feeling comfortable? What should we expect belonging to look like in the church? What are some of its enduring qualities?
Right. It has to mean more than that, doesn't it, Becca? Yeah. And by the way, it's good to see you again. I got to know you a few weeks ago in this medium, and I'm delighted for this chance to talk with you as well as my old friend Phil. Thank you.
Thank you.
It has to mean more than we all agree with each other. In fact, I would argue that there are ways in which the church has perpetuated an illusion around that. I'll tell you a quick story. Mm-hmm. I used to get calls from clergy and lay leaders of congregations asking me, as a sociologist of religion, to come into their church and help diversify what they always called a homogeneous white congregation. Mm-hmm. And from the get-go, I would say, no, I won't do that, even though I'd written about diversity and its values. And people would be shocked. Why? And I would say, because there's no such thing as a homogeneous white congregation. There's only groups of white people pretending that they don't have any differences, keeping all their differences under cover for fear that if they touched on their differences, conflict would emerge and the whole thing would blow up. And my question, if I were a person of color, if I were other, quote, in any way, from what I see on the surface of your congregation, is if you all can't get along with each other, why in heaven's name would I want to join? I, who have a visible difference, when you who look like each other are afraid of touching those points of difference. So I think one of the things we have to do is, is unpack the illusion that churches as they stand are in fact creating space for people to get to the bottom of things that might divide them. And I'm not just talking about political opinions or ideological orientations. I'm talking about things that happen in people's lives. I'm talking about relationships breaking up. I'm talking about vocational despair and failure. I'm talking about living with the consequences of bad decisions, et cetera, et cetera. Things that people keep under cover in church. It's classically said there's lots of folks who'd rather talk about such things to a bartender or to a stranger on a train than talk about them within their congregation, which they see as a gossip mill. So I think the reasonable meaning of belonging, as I've thought about this, as I've experienced it, is around a series of questions that I think most of us ask when we get involved with a group or a relationship of any sort. Questions like, am I seen? Am I heard? Am I taken seriously? Does my voice matter? When I express myself in pain or fear or hope, do I get a response? Those are simple questions, but I think they're the fundamental human questions. And I think when the answer can be yes, by and large, I am seen, I am heard. When I express myself, I get a response, not demanding that the response is, exactly what I want, but an effort to connect with me around those critical points in life. When the answer is yes, I think we have something at least approaching community. See how they love one another. They're paying attention to one another. When the answer is no, people fall away into that loneliness that Chris was talking about. Or, and I think this is an untapped topic in our society, they strike out in violence because they need to know, they need to let people know, I'm here. I have a voice. I am making a claim. I watched, as many of us did, the events of January 6th, which were so heavily driven by white supremacy, by anti-democracy tropes and ideologies. And part of what I saw was a lot of people who have reverted to violence to say, I'm here. And so the question arises for me, how might this country be different if in those voluntary associations that dot this country, the ones Alexis de Tocqueville said were so critical to the future of democracy in his book, Democracy in America, what if in those voluntary associations, including the church, we intentionally focused in strategic ways on trying to make sure that people feel seen and heard and responded to, taken seriously. Most people don't want, most people realize as they grow up, they can't have it their way all the time. That's a kind of arrested development human attitude that I must always have it my way. Our hope and our delight is when we're taken seriously and we can become part of the mix. We win some and we lose some, but at least we're feeling alive and connected in that communal way.
Yes. So those are very helpful questions to consider. Am I seen? Am I heard? Am I being taken seriously? Are people responding to me? So let's try and broaden that out. You were going there towards the end of just our sense of belonging as a nation. Could you tell us how you are understanding this crisis of belonging in our nation today? Would you add any more to this sense that people feel like they are not being heard?
Well, let's start with the proposition that a nation uh, can't be understood as a community in the terms that we're now talking about. Again, that's the task to be carried by this whole layer of life that I call pre-political, the layer that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, the layer of voluntary associations, including the church. I've always thought, Becca, that it's very dangerous for the church to promote itself as the church family, because the family is a very intimate, closed system. That what's this pre-political layer, this public layer of life, is where the church can join both the private and the political, not by getting political, but by doing the pre-political work of weaving relationships among the company of strangers, as I called it in one of my books. I guess Simon and Garfunkel always also used that phrase with some success. So it's about weaving and reweaving the local venues of life, where I continue to feel against, despite the odds, that the church has the congregations of every sort and of every faith tradition have really important opportunities in helping us through the fragmentation of our body politic and the growing violence of our political life, which has waxed and waned over the years. It ain't the first time, and we're not the first people who have suffered from this, but it is waxing again, the violence of politics, as everybody feels marginalized and alienated. Um, I don't know a single person, right or left or center, who isn't saying, I just feel left out of this whole deal. There are people actively hating on me for my beliefs and my views, and there is no national solution to that. Martin Buber said, a nation is a community of communities, and only by working on the sub-communities can we get any traction on this thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
Parker, when we've talked in the past, you've referenced Wendell Berry, the writer, the poet, and his distinction between being a member and a citizen. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, Wendell Berry is just one of my very favorite writers. Poetry, prose, novels, the whole kielbasa, and his brilliant novels over the years have portrayed a community on the Kentucky River called Port William, which is not unlike the area where Wendell Berry and his wife farm and have farmed for a long time. And whenever he writes about Port William, he uses the phrase in referring to the collective. He uses the phrase the Port William membership, and I've always loved that phrase. We are members of one another, and I think Berry gets this pretty directly from his own relationship to the Christian tradition, which of course permeates the area where he's lived and farmed all his life. It's such a different notion, isn't it, than the civic community or citizenship. It would be wonderful if those were synonyms for one another, but as we use them, they're not. I mean, when politicians think about citizens, they send their pollsters out to find how to divide and conquer, or how to maximize the vote from their base. But if we think about the simple truth that we are members of one another, something new starts to emerge. That's church language, but I think it's fascinating to find places like Wendell Berry's novels where it's used as civic language as well. I think a point that I'd like to make in this context, Phil, is that being members of one another doesn't mean that everything is peachy keen. I think most people who have been or are in a marriage or in a partner relationship of any degree of seriousness fully understand that being joined to another life doesn't mean the absence of conflict. And in fact, most of us who've, been working on our relational lives for more than 5 minutes have realized that that conflict can actually be the doorway into deeper relationship. Conflict is where we start to get traction on who we really are, and we start to get traction on things like, I guess I had an unconscious agenda to change who this other person really is. And that was dumb from the get-go. And if that's what I'm looking for here, someone malleable to remake in my own image, then I've made a bad choice, and something has to give. So conflict, for those of us who have experienced it, as everyone has, I think, in intimate relationships, is a doorway into community. And that's true in larger forms of community as well. It really saddens me to see churches come upon conflict, moments of conflict, and the air kind of goes out of everything, as if we are failing the Christian dream. Well, read the scriptures again. Read about all the moments of conflict in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian texts, and understand how God works in conflict to help us become more honest, to help us become clearer, to help us get a grip and get real and get our feet on the ground where we can continue walking through this, very fractured landscape of our lives. I've always felt, and I don't know, I've never found out quite how to articulate this, but that long before Christianity is an ethic, it's a statement about what's real. And what's real is different from what we dream, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Dorothy Day, who was one of the most grounded Christians who ever lived, with her ministry to the very, very poor on the Lower East Side of New York and across this country, loved to quote Dostoevsky, who said, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams."
Yeah, for sure. Parker, as you know, a number of the folks who are with us this morning are pastors of congregations and then also a lot of lay leaders. And so they all deal with these issues of conflict within congregations and how then to create a sense of belonging in a fractured place. I had a little bit of experience with this. A decade ago, Wisconsin was torn apart by disputes over the role of unions and public employees, and there were lots of demonstrations in Madison. And in the congregation I was serving, it's a fairly liberal congregation, and I thought I could be very wise and help them understand some of the views of the Christian social gospel. So we got a group together, and before I could even impart my words of wisdom, the discussion began, and one of them was a teacher who felt very put upon by what was happening. Another was from business and talked about his experience growing up where the unions harassed his family, and another was a state employee, and everybody in that group wound up listening to each other. Fortunately, they didn't have to listen to me because I just stayed out of the way mostly. In your book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, you have some suggestions about how congregations can approach some of these issues that divide them and how they can come back together. And it's things like breaking bread together and finding ways to reach a consensus. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of those things, some of those structural things congregations might be able to do that would help get into these divides?
Well, let me just say first, Phil, that I've known you for a long time, and I know about your work in journalism and the ministry. And in the ministry, you've done a lot of great things by, quote, staying out of the way. Uh, I kind of have to believe that you set the table for for the opportunities to stay out of the way. So that's probably a key thingy, technical theological term thingy.
Right,
I don't
right.
want to lose anybody at that point. Um, so, what interests me is that I think a lot of this is fairly simple, but I call them secrets hidden in plain sight. And I also think, and I'm looping back now to my days as a community organizer in Washington, D.C., where I began to realize that what I was doing as a community organizer was not getting people to do what I thought they ought to do. Instead, at my best, I was providing them with excuses and permissions to do things they wanted to do, but were too awkward or shy or fearful to do for themselves. For example, um, in this changing neighborhood where I was working for a while, with a lot of newcomers arriving, the most direct and helpful thing we could do would be to get members of the congregations in that community, and we were working with about 35 congregations of many sorts, to get the members of those congregations to go up to the door of a recently arrived neighbor, introduce themselves, and ask how it's going, and invite some stories about who these people are and what they bring to the new neighborhood, rather than fearing them because they look different or talk different or believe different than we do, whoever we may be. But in our society, even back then, uh, that puts people in an awkward position. So what I did was I dummied up a questionnaire, gave hundreds of people in these congregations clipboards and questionnaires and pencils, and we organized a series of Saturdays when they went out into the community and, quote, did research, which basically consisted of walking up to the door with your clipboard in hand and saying, "Hi, I'm from the Silver Spring Group Ministry. How you doing?" you know, and tell me your story. So this clipboard and this questionnaire and this group identity enabled folks to meet their neighbors, and then we brought them back to one of the bigger churches where several hundred people could gather, and we had meals where they could share stories with each other, which eventually emerged. It resulted in the creation of a community foundation and the creation of a lot of activities that helped weave that rapidly changing community together so that it wouldn't go the way of redlining, blockbusting, and all the other destructive things that keep replicating our problems in this country. Um, One of my great moments in community organizing, again to the point of what can congregations do, uh, was when early on in my work in DC, I went downtown to speak with a Black clergyman who was very well known for extraordinary work in his own challenging neighborhood. And I kind of, as a young guy, walked into his office and said, "So, what's your secret?" And he looked at me and smiled beatifically and said, "Potluck suppers." Well, with a PhD in the sociology of religion from Berkeley, that didn't seem like a good answer to me. But he patiently explained that breaking bread together has all kinds of meanings and possibilities. And I particularly remember one program that he did systematically through the year of bringing neighborhood kids, street kids, together with the police who served in that area and setting up over the table situations where they got to know each other's stories with measurable impact on what went on in the streets, so that the next time something happened that required police presence, those officers might in fact know a couple of those kids. And your reference to Act 10 makes me wonder, Phil, about situations in which a church can do so much more than just preach from the pulpit about this decision or that. Not to say that's not important, but lots and lots of teachers, for example, and school administrators, and people for and against unions belong to churches. What about dedicated groups for those folks to talk things through in a congregational setting where the temperature, I'm not going to say it's lower, but it's more habitable, because we do share some fundamental underlying belief. I mean, Chris, in his opening remarks, outlined significantly and importantly and well how balkanized our religious communities have become around sort of fixed ideologies. But there's still a lot of opportunities, I think, for congregations, again, of many sorts, to be the wild card in this mix and create those small opportunities that can make a big difference. And I'll just say one more thing. I know we need to move on. I think part of what there are beliefs that we have to recover or rethink, and then recover, such as conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. Tension isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's part of reality, and we should come to terms with it and use it for good. It's an engine. It's an energy. We have to recover a belief in the importance of small things. And we live in a society where the media present things on such massive scale, or I might say, our use of the media, our consumption of the media ends up with us having this picture of massive problems and very few possibilities. And what in God's name am I to do about all that? The easy answer is nothing. So I just hunker down and tuck away and disengage from my own responsibilities as a citizen, as a human being, as a member, as part of the membership.
Parker, that's a really good setup for a question Becca has. But before she gets to that, I just want to let the folks who are watching this today know that in a few minutes we're going to shift over to questions from the folks who are out there. And if you put your questions in the chat, Chris will come back and help guide the question and answer period. But start thinking about questions you might have for Parker. We'll be shifting in about 10 minutes or so over to your questions. But Becca, you've got a good follow-up to what Parker was just saying.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So going back to congregations, and those being pockets of places where we can start to redefine some of these concepts or understand how to move forward with these concepts. I'm wondering if you can speak to how to delineate for congregations, how to delineate between non-negotiables, things that like we cannot bend on this, and allowable points of contention, and how you can lead your congregation through some of those points. So for example, masks in church. Should we wear masks in church? Should we even be gathering in church during COVID? And people can be going off of very biblical ideas. One, we should not cower to fear. We have not been given a spirit of fear. Or we should love people well, and people are interpreting loving others well in many different ways. So how are leaders to distinguish between these two, non-negotiable and that's just a point of contention?
Well, I have to say, Becca, and I don't mean to be discouraging about this, but it's a lesson that I think we need to learn. In some situations now, the train wreck has already happened, and it's really hard to get the train on track, back on track. I think the ongoing job for congregations, and life starts anew each day in some significant ways, is to get ahead of the train wreck by acclimating people to those non-negotiables, or by use of those non-negotiables, acclimating people in situations that have smaller stakes than the one that we're currently in. Sadly, and I never imagined this would happen, a public health problem has become politicized, and it breaks out almost along party lines, certainly along ideological lines. To me, that's, we're deep in a kind of madness when a virus that doesn't care what your politics are is simply and plainly killing people all over the place, right and left. And the question, do we have a responsibility to each other in that, should be, in my opinion, a no-brainer. Of course we do. Of course we do. I have a responsibility to my family. I have a responsibility to my neighbors. I have a responsibility to the people who work in stores and in healthcare institutions, et cetera, et cetera. I even have a responsibility to myself to do everything I can not to burden our healthcare system further. I'm 82, soon to be 83. I might well have something come along that requires hospitalization that's not related to COVID. I should try to stay in that territory rather than add another problem. So in congregational life, we have to have processes that accustom people to listening to each other, to connecting with each other, to taking each other seriously before the train wreck. And because once the train wreck has happened, it's really hard to get the train back on track. So let's get to know each other. Let's do more autobiographical storytelling in congregations. Let's establish processes. In my work, we gather in what we call circles of trust, and we have a very simple ground rule. We will listen to each other without attempting to fix, save, advise, or correct each other. That's a way to help people be heard. Suspend the normal ground rules. Don't listen to another person for a few minutes and then try to fix or save or advise or correct them. That leaves people feeling unheard. Listen to them and then give them the gift of asking honest, open questions about what they've just expressed to help, quote, hear them into deeper speech. A phrase that I stole from a feminist theologian named Nell Morton. So when I think of non-negotiables, I don't think of creedal non-negotiables. That's starting at too high a level, and I think it's a dead end. I think of procedural non-negotiables. In this gathering of our congregation, we will, for this period of time, follow these ground rules about how we talk to each other, and that's non-negotiable. If you want to be part of this, then you sign off on the ground rules as process. It doesn't last forever. That's not the only good way to be together. But when we're doing it, we learn stuff about each other. We become more deeply joined. We don't leave people feeling unheard and arrogantly advised or put down, as is often the case. We have to keep weaving that communal fabric, storytelling, procedural ground rules, working together, doing tasks together. I understand that studies of church growth show that the deepest sense of community comes in the early years when a congregation has tasks to do. Let's paint the basement and turn it into a rec room. Let's polish the pews. Let's plant stuff outside to make the grounds more attractive. And often the less money a congregation has, the more the sense of community, because that's when people have to call on one another to get those jobs done. I don't think any of it is rocket science, but I think what's important is to keep it on the ground, keep it human scale, and let people see how we love one another.
Place to bring this part to a conclusion. I think Becca has a bit of a benediction.
I do.
Before we leave, but then we're going to shift over to questions from the folks who are gathered out there in Cyberland.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We just found a poem from Amanda Gorman's new book, Call Us What We Carry, and this poem is called The Miracle of Mourning. And it just says simply this: while we might feel small, separate, and all alone, our people have never been more closely tethered. The question isn't if we can weather this unknown, but how we will weather this unknown together. That just seemed like a nice way to wrap that up. So thank you very much, Parker, for spending your time with us. I think we're going to turn it over to Chris to help lead the Q&A time. But we appreciate you spending the time with us. And Phil, thank you very much for directing most of this.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks so much, Parker.
Thank you both. Been fun.
And Chris, over to you.
Wonderful. Well, this has already been very rich. Thank you, Parker. It's an honor to get to have some conversation with you via the questions that are coming in. Another reminder, use the opportunity to put your questions into the chat, and I'll try to filter through those. Oh, yeah, even a reminder there on the screen. I want to start with just one question. Almost everyone who's here today is participating in one way or another in our program, Awaken Dane. And one of the practices that the participants in Awaken Dane are engaged in is trying to get to know their neighbors and their neighborhood. I wonder, in some of your earlier comments, you alluded to this. If you could say a little bit more about how you see the role of place or the local as part of this sort of journey into sort of healing the crisis of belonging or finding a way toward belonging, both, again, for the places in which we live, but then also for the churches and the people in them. So what role does place play in belonging?
Well, thanks, Chris. I think place is really critical, and I'm very well aware, as I think we all are, that one of the things technology does is to dislocate us. We get the illusion that we are no longer in a location. I mean, in the past 2 years, I've, quote, met and, quote, spoken with, all true, but with different meanings than heretofore, met and spoken with people all over the world whose place I will never be in, and with whom I don't really know exactly how they relate to place, nor do they know my place and how I relate to it. And there's some values in that, but I think the human urge to feel at home on the face of the earth, as well as at home in one's own skin, two of the great human needs. I think the feeling at home on the face of the earth has a lot to do with feeling at home in place. And those questions that I asked about that people are asking with regards belonging, and we were talking about them in terms of churches or congregations at the time. Those are the same questions people are asking about their neighborhood and their local community. I'm a great fan, just to provide a brief footnote here, of the work that John McKnight and Peter Block have done around ABCD, an approach to community organizing that depends exclusively on local resources rather than bringing in experts from on high to tell people how to do things. So there's a real literature out there about cultivating place. It's a growing literature, and I'd urge people to turn to it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Parker. I've got a handful of questions here. I'm going to just serve them up the way I've got them here. Question from Lisa Nelson. Only by working on the sub-communities can we get any traction. And that's a loose paraphrase of what you said, referring, I think, to the Buber quote. Can you say more about the relationship of the sub-communities to the greater community and the impact that one has on the other? I think what she's getting at here is, if we're all just a bunch of sub-communities, how does that actually help the larger body, the larger body politic, as you referred to it earlier?
Well, one of the things that I've studied a lot in my life for, I guess, 40 years are the great transformative social movements of my time, of the 20th and 21st century. And I think every movement you look at, the civil rights movement in this country, the movements for liberation in South Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the women's movement around the world, has built up from dedicated actions of sub-communities into a sense of shared endeavor, a kind of super community, as it were. But people can't identify personally with a super community. You can, in fact, identify with a subset of that much larger community and feel part of the action. So I think in the formation of social movements, nothing happens. Nothing happens because one brave individual like Rosa Parks or Nelson Mandela or Václav Havel takes a courageous action. Things happen when people gather around those concerns, now symbolized by one person's action or courage, and come together in sub-communities to join a larger effort. And this is where I'm going to pick up quickly on something that I didn't have a chance to say when I was talking with Phil and Becca. We have to recover our belief in the power of small things, small actions, because truth be told, it's all any of us are capable of. And if we lose that belief, the cumulative power of small actions, we have to orchestrate, of course, and that's where movement organizers are geniuses. But ordinary folk like you and me, there are small things we can do to keep the movement alive.
Yeah, well, that's so important, and I think it runs counterculture, as you alluded to, sort of the media, and even in our churches, maybe a focus on maximizing effectiveness and impact leads us away from thinking about the importance of creating culture through, as you said, procedures, processes of conversation and listening to each other. I think one of the things that I appreciate in your earlier comments is just how central conversation is to the kinds of gatherings that actually facilitate belonging. It's not just content delivery, it's actually interaction, hearing, listening, reflecting. That kind of interaction is so important and really sort of easily takes second place in the life of our churches to the more typical norms of the sort of Sunday event. So
we have to do, Chris, I think we have to do in the churches what we have to do in democracy. In democracy, we have to help people understand citizenship is not a spectator sport. And in the churches, we have to help people understand membership is not a spectator sport. And that's where clergy can be involved constructively or otherwise. And that's where lay people can step up and do their own faith journey rather than depending on a clergy person to act it out for them week in and week out.
I think that's a nice segue to a question here from Kathy Chrisman. She, again, picks up on something you said. It's easier to share with the bartender than the pastor. How can we begin to shift this norm, especially when the pews right now are empty, or even, post-COVID or pre-COVID, some pews are not too full. How do we give permission to safely engage in conflict? So What would you say about the pastor's role in facilitating this kind of um, space for dialogue, hearing each other's stories?
I think the pastor has a critical role, and it involves legitimating these occasions when people are asked not to turn to the expert or the authority as they see it, but to turn to each other. I want to be clear that I'm not anti-pastor. I'm not anti-clerical. I am a Quaker, and there's for those who know the Quaker tradition, at least my part of the Quaker tradition, we don't have ordained clergy, but
Mm-hmm.
there's an old saying among Quakers of my stripe. We say that we have been accused of abolishing the clergy, but it's not true. We abolished the laity,
Ah,
uh,
yeah.
and so it's about everybody's ministry. But the pastor in a mainline Protestant church, for example, can issue the invitation to come together and, for example, learn a new set of ground rules around political discourse, even online. And those ground rules have to do with the ones I enunciated earlier: no fixing,
Mm-hmm.
no saving, no advising, no correcting each other, but asking each other honest, open questions. All of that is harder than it sounds, more complicated. I wrote a book about it called A Hidden Wholeness, if anyone wants to go there. And it's again the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal. But it often takes a pastor to say, "Look, folks, this is good stuff." And we have a lot of pastors who've gone through our clergy programs, so there's some who are
Mm-hmm.
prepared to say that. And it's simply a different form of leadership than always stepping to the pulpit, having the message, and hoping that it gets received,
Yeah.
or always being in the teacherly seat. It's rather inviting people to teach and learn from each other.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned from Alan Roxburgh, I don't know if you know that name, but is that a pastor, some of the most sort of precious opportunities that a pastor have is to convene and to set the question, set the table, as you said, describing Phil's role in his little anecdote. And I think that it really is sort of an oft neglected role that leaders of all kinds play in the church, is convening and then sort of setting the questions that frame what we're going to do together.
Yeah, and I would love, I'm sure you would too, Chris, I'd love to see seminaries do more around forming that kind of leadership than the more top down forms.
Well, we're certainly trying to do that here. You just set me
Yes,
up
we
for a
are.
plug, but yeah, no, I completely agree, and certainly build that into the courses that I offer. Got a
Well,
question here from Nick at Advent Lutheran, and this maybe invites you to draw, especially on your work around racial justice and um, equality. What are the practices or tasks that we can do if we want to become more welcoming and increase belonging? And this is coming as their congregation is embarking on a process toward more racial equity and anti-racism.
I'll go back to it's a very important question, and it probably goes well beyond what we have time for today. But I'll go back to what I said about really doing a very thorough self examination about how we are with each other around
Mm,
those things that divide us. And on questions of race, it's pretty clear that we are deeply divided.
mm,
Um, and not just in the highly visible and most egregious ways. I, for example, am a fan of the writing, I guess I attempt to learn from the writing of Ibram X. Kendi, Kendi. Kendi, the writer who has argued that there is no such thing as a person who has not a racist bone in his or her body. He says everybody has racist bones in it. He says the truth is, he says, that one faces a daily choice between being a racist or an anti-racist. And being an anti-racist means in the moment to say or act in ways that witness and testify and push back against racism. That to me, that's a very clarifying and cleansing call. And it raises the question, for example, of what do I do? What do I say when someone in my friendship group or on my Facebook page makes a racist comment? To say nothing of a homophobic comment, a misogynistic comment, an anti-Muslim comment, whatever. What I've developed for myself is the habit, when necessary, of saying to the person who makes such a comment, you need to understand that you're talking about friends of mine. And when you say what you say, I feel wounded personally. I'm not going to speak for them. They're not here. And but I want you to know, I want you to face into the fact that you have wounded me because you're talking about people I care for. And without going on in that scenario, I can guarantee you that saying, making such a statement, which I regard as an anti-racist statement, has consequences. It changes the conversation. We're no longer arguing about people who aren't in the room and our ideological positions. We're now arguing about a breach that's right here between thee and me. My job is to hang in with that, to see if there's a possibility beyond that breach for some kind of healing or at least learning, some kind of coming to the table, as it were, for a continuing conversation. But I can't afford to mince my words. I also think that we need to do a lot of work around this notion, and this is, again, part of my personal ministry, so I don't know what the systematic program is here. But I have concluded through reading Kendi and other more face-to-face experiences that when white people deny the reality of white privilege, they're just wrong. And we need to be able to work with each other around that. I'm sorry that your white uncle or your white nephew or your white friend didn't get the job or the apartment that they wanted, but I can guarantee you that wasn't because of their race. It was for some other perhaps unfair reason, but not because of their race. And I think we also need to talk about the fact, as white people, so for me, white people talking to white people about race is the necessary prelude to any effort to go larger into the world. We also need to talk about the tendency of white people to reduce white supremacy to people who wear hoods and burn crosses. That, I believe, is a cheap out. White supremacy is pervasive. It's in the DNA of this country. I and every white person has benefited, quote, from it. But as Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us, ultimately it's the oppressor who pays the greater price than even the oppressed for systemic oppression. And it seems clear to me that we're paying that price right now. That out of our failure to reckon with the pervasiveness of white supremacy and the benefits people like me have gotten from it, we have created a society in which nobody feels at home.
Parker, I wonder if, and this is related to some of the questions that have been offered and a comment you just made, I wonder if you'd help us think about not only what we've been talking about, which is sort of within the congregation, the processes, the procedures of learning to hear across difference and talk about conflict, but what role other types of associations or even relationships between congregations might play in sort of creating a fabric of belonging. One of the partners, of course, on this grant is Collaboration Project. Part of their mission, of course, is bringing churches together. And yet, I think I heard you offering sort of a cautioning word about rushing to talk to a black church about racism or something. So maybe I'm just reading between the lines there. But what role would you see there being for interactions between congregations? And I'm thinking about this particularly in light of the reality that although no congregation is totally homogeneous, some of the critical differences in our community are mapped onto the differences in our congregations, politically, ethnically, etc., racially. So, what role or insights would you have for us in thinking about the relationships between, I suppose, what would be called sub-communities, between congregations in a larger sort of theological vision of the church as both churches and itself a larger sub-community?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that almost everything that I hope I've said or have attempted to say, however inadequately, about doing this kind of work in congregations could also be said about other forms of voluntary association and groups that attempt to network voluntary associations.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think I'm right that hardly anything I've said demands a shared creedal foundation. Um, I think we're drawing here on some sort of fundamental human values that are articulated across a wide variety of traditions, including secular humanism, which I regard as a form of spirituality, because for me, spirituality is any way a person has of responding to the eternal human yearning to be connected with something larger than my own ego. That's a complicated formula when you start to think about it, because sometimes what we get connected with is stuff like the Third Reich or white supremacy. And sometimes what we get connected with is healthy communities of the sort that we've been thinking about this morning, and how to craft them and how to sustain them. So I think that, because the delineation between various forms of Christianity and other world religions is in so many ways creedal. If I can avoid thinking of sort of stuff that has to be rooted in creedal affirmations, then I think the ideas have wider applicability. I would hope that's the case.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up with a question from, I think it's probably John Anderson, under the Collaboration Project account. He writes, what do you see as the most hopeful sources of belonging for the church and or the broader society? What might bring us together? So where should we be focusing for hope, finding hope in the midst of this crisis?
I think hope begins with a realistic assessment of the human condition. It's a condition that I talk about as always and forever living in the tragic gap, the gap between what is the harsh realities around us and what we know is possible, not what we wish for, but what we know is possible because we have from time to time seen it with our own eyes. That gap is perpetual. So on the one hand, we have rampant greed driving an economy that's bringing so many ships down. On the other hand, we have seen instances of radical generosity and radical economic equality. I lived in such a situation for 11 years. So we know that's possible. It's not a wish dream. But the hard reality is that these gaps will never be fully and satisfactorily closed. And anyone who's tried to close such a gap, take any of your heroes, was unable to die saying, thank God I gave my life to that, because now everyone on the planet can check it off their to-do list
Yeah.
now and forever.
Yeah.
So hope is having a realistic vision of the tragic gap and taking step after small step in that tragic gap to try to advance the best possibilities of the situation. Hope is an action, not an attitude. And I take inspiration from every single individual and every single movement who has kept moving their feet in the tragic gap. And that empowers me and inspires me to keep my feet moving as well. And to keep regrounding myself in this notion that hope is not some wishful kind of thinking.
Right.
It's not attitudinal. And I'll revert back to my own Christian tradition here. It's embodied, it's incarnate.
Yeah.
It's walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
Yeah, I love that way of describing what it is that we're striving for, it as something that we know is possible, and your own references of things that we've actually tasted before. We've caught a glimpse of it. Certainly, we would hope that the church would be a place in which the wider society and then each of us who are part of it catch a glimpse of a kind of community, a kind of belonging that God intends, God will accomplish, and is possible, for God's creation. And so, thank you. I've got a question here.
I'll just, if I may, just at that moment, Chris, I'll just loop back briefly to where I began with Phil. That was the glimpse I caught in the Methodist Youth Fellowship in the church that I grew up in Wilmette, Illinois. And it has stayed with me. What you say is very important because it's embodied, it's incarnate.
Yeah.
I was a kid who felt very out of place in that competitive, highly stratified high school, but in that community created by the youth director at that church, I felt at home in my own skin, and I felt at home in the world of relative diversity. So let's just put a pin in that one and keep our eye on it.
Yeah, and those are certainly the kinds of stories you could share autobiographically in a church setting. When have you most felt known and experienced belonging in that way? Creating that sense of vision for the kind of communities we want to be as a church and the kind of community we want to be part of locally. Question here from, I'm not quite sure if this is Pastor Trishmas or who this is, Pa Trishmas. You mentioned your hesitancy around the term family for congregations. Would you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I see our society as having three layers. Really, any healthy society, three layers. There's a layer of power, let's call it the political, up top. Down at the bottom, there's a layer of private life, which is the domain of the family and friendship groups. And in the middle, there's this critical layer of public life, where we have voluntary associations, we have the streets of the city where the company of strangers gather, we have, parks and sidewalk cafes and all kinds of ways for people who aren't family, but who are members of one another, ultimately, in larger and smaller ways. They gather, they see each other, they experience each other. One of the big things we're missing right now in this pandemic world is the public life.
Mm-hmm.
It's stunning to see pictures of New York City with empty streets, no action whatsoever. I remember the streets of New York City as a place where I got some of my first embodied examples of what it meant to live in a pluralistic democratic society. And you know where the most basic of those lessons happens? It happens while you walk down the sidewalk through a crowd,
Mm.
and you have to learn to jog left, jog right, speed up, slow down,
Yeah.
negotiate the dance of the
Yeah.
crowd in order to keep from smashing your nose or breaking
Yeah.
your arm. But it's doable, and you learn something about the negotiation necessary to live in a complex community. So
Yeah.
it's it's things like that that we're missing right now that we need to reclaim. My objection to an obsession about creating a church family is that linguistically it takes the church out of that public realm and puts it back in that private realm,
Yeah.
which I think is where it stays too often. You know, I don't let just anybody into my family. And
Yeah.
if a stranger comes along into my home without permission or invitation, we have a name for it. It's called
Mm-hmm.
home invasion. It's a crime. Um, the
Mm.
lines in private life, which we all value, are pretty sharp. You know, strangers get in by marriage or by friendship, but always by invitation and permission.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
but the public realm is where we all have to deal with each other. Everybody in my high school is there, whatever class you're in. And the beauty of that youth group was it wasn't family;
Mm.
it was a company of strangers
Mm.
from New Trier High
Yeah.
School.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that gets to sort of what kind of organization you see the church as. Is it a public or private organization? And of course, the theologian has to say, ecclesia. This is the called out people. It's sort of a public, semi-political term right there in the New Testament and in our theology. So that's helpful to sort of remember what kind of community we're meant to be. One that reflects, I'd say, the place rather than sort of all the alignment and bloodlines that run through a family.
Yeah, exactly. And I think of it, Chris, as a straddling institution that has openness on both ends.
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
so a kind of third thing.
Wonderful. Well, Parker, this has been just so rich, and you've given us a lot to reflect on. I'm going to turn my attention. I don't know if you can't really see him, but I'm going to give you an applause because that was so awesome. Um, and as we've been discussing, one of the things that's so important in this growth toward belonging is not just hearing great ideas about belonging, but actually engaging in conversations and sharing our own thoughts and being seen and heard.